My name is Myra Wells, and 6 months ago, I stood on the sidewalk of the Grand Belmont in Manhattan, clutching a silver box and watching my own family's security team treat me like a common trespasser. It was my sister Victoria's big day, the social event of the decade, and I had flown 3,000 miles from Los Angeles just to be told that my name had been scrubbed from the guest list as if it were a clerical error. The staff looked at me with that specific brand of New York pity, flipping through a leather-bound book of 400 names, none of which were mine. When I called Victoria, she didn't even lower the volume of the champagne toasts in the background. She just sneered into the phone, telling me that a starving photographer didn't fit the aesthetic of a Thornton wedding. So, I did what I've done my entire life. I stayed quiet. I walked to the gift table, placed my small silver box among the towers of Tiffany blue and Hermès orange, and I left. I didn't stay for the cake. I didn't stay for the speeches. I went straight back to JFK, checked into the Delta Lounge, and watched the sunset over the tarmac. I knew that in a few hours, when Victoria opened that box in front of the most influential families in New England, her perfect world was going to suffer a catastrophic structural failure. She hasn't stopped calling me since that night. My mother has left 32 voicemails. My father has sent emails that transitioned from demands to pleas. But I haven't answered a single one. Because before I tell you what was in that box, before I show you the receipts of a 28-year-old betrayal, you need to understand the day I realized I was never actually a daughter in that house. I was just a shadow that happened to share their last name. Growing up in our 3-story colonial in Beacon Hill wasn't about love, it was about curation. My parents, Harold and Patricia Wells, didn't raise children, they managed a portfolio. Victoria was the blue-chip stock, the 3 years older, straight-A, piano-playing prodigy who wore designer coats and sat for portraits that actually made it onto the mantelpiece. I was the hand-me-down, the quiet one, the girl who learned early on that if you don't make a sound, people eventually forget you're even in the room. My 10th birthday was the day the mask finally slipped. I'd been counting down the minutes to double digits, imagining a cake with my name on it, or maybe a party like the one Victoria had, the one with the catered lunch and the 40 kids from her class. I woke up at 6 in the morning and ran to the kitchen, but the only thing waiting for me was the sound of my mother's voice on the phone, aggressively coordinating Victoria's upcoming cotillion. My father didn't even look up from the Wall Street Journal. When I whispered that it was my birthday, my mother just covered the receiver, told me we'd do something later, and went back to discussing the floral arrangements for her favorite daughter. Later never came. It never does in a house where the light only shines in one direction. But that evening, there was a knock on my bedroom door. It was Grandma Eleanor, my father's mother, the only woman in that family who knew that a colonial house could also be a cage. She was holding a small, wrapped box. "Happy birthday, my darling girl," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the dark. Inside wasn't a doll or a dress. It was a camera. A real one. A silver Leica with a leather strap that felt heavy and honest in my small hands. "You have an artist's eye, Myra," she whispered, touching my cheek. "One day, the world will see what I see in you. And when they do, they won't be able to look away." I didn't know it then, but Grandma Eleanor wasn't just giving me a hobby. She was giving me a lens to see through the lies of Beacon Hill. She was planting a seed that would eventually grow large enough to tear the whole house down. To understand the structural integrity of a lie, you have to look at the points where it refuses to bend. For the Wells family, that point was my graduation from the Rhode Island School of Design. I had done the impossible. I'd earned a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious art programs in the country without a single cent of my father's legacy money. I thought, in my naive, 21-year-old heart, that this would be the moment they'd finally see me. I was the keynote speaker. I had been selected to represent my class, to talk about the power of vision and the courage to pursue a path that isn't paved with hedge fund dividends. I practiced my speech until the words were etched into my marrow, imagining my mother's proud smile in the front row and my father's firm, validating handshake. The morning of the ceremony, I came downstairs in my cap and gown, the fabric rustling in the quiet of the kitchen. Victoria was there, scrolling through her phone, her breakfast untouched. My parents were huddled over a laptop, their faces tight with a focused energy I'd only ever seen them use for her. "The ceremony starts at 2, I said, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to be. "We should leave by 1 to get good seats. I'm the first speaker." My mother didn't even turn around. "Sweetheart, something came up," she said, her voice light, as if she were apologizing for a minor scheduling conflict at the dry cleaners. "Victoria has a networking event with Goldman Sachs. It's a huge opportunity for her career. We can't miss it." I stood there in my graduation gown, clutching my speech notes, the ink of my own name feeling like a foreign language. "It's my graduation," I said. "I'm the speaker." My father finally glanced at me, his eyes cold and dismissive. "Photography isn't a real career, Myra. It's a vanity project. Maybe if you'd thought about business school like your sister, we'd be more inclined to prioritize the day. Victoria is the future of this family's reputation. You're just taking pictures of strangers." Victoria didn't say a word. She just smirked at her phone, the victor of a battle she hadn't even had to fight. I walked to that ceremony alone. I gave my speech to a room full of strangers who clapped for a girl they didn't know, while the people who were supposed to know me were busy networking for the daughter who already had everything. But I wasn't entirely alone. In the front row, sitting as straight and regal as a queen, was Grandma Eleanor. She clapped louder than anyone in the building. When I walked off that stage with my diploma, she took my hands in hers and whispered something I wouldn't fully understand for years. "Remember, sweetheart," she said, her eyes flashing with a secret fire. "The greatest treasures aren't always the ones people fight over. Sometimes, they're the ones quietly passed on. Your father and sister are looking at the shine, but they've forgotten how to check the foundation." She kissed my forehead, and 3 days later, I bought a one-way ticket to Los Angeles with nothing but 2 suitcases and that silver Leica. I didn't say goodbye. There was no one in that house who would have noticed I was gone until the hand-me-downs ran out. I spent the next 10 years building an empire in the shadows, waiting for the moment when the starving artist would finally send the bill. Los Angeles is a city built on the illusion of success, but I was building something real. I started as an assistant to a high-end wedding photographer, lugging equipment through the sand in Malibu and the hills of Bel Air. I learned how to see people when they thought the cameras were off. I learned that the more a bride spent on her dress, the more she was usually hiding the cracks in the relationship. I saved every penny. I worked 90-hour weeks. And slowly, client by client, I built Everlight Studios. I didn't use the Wells name. I used my vision. By the time I turned 28, Everlight was doing $3 million in annual revenue. I had a team of 12, a studio overlooking downtown LA, and a client list that included names my father only saw in the headlines of the Business Review. My family never asked. To them, I was still the awkward one who moved to the coast to take pictures for a living. Victoria called occasionally, but only to use me as a sounding board for her own achievements. Senior Marketing Director at 29. A corner office in the financial district. An engagement to Marcus Thornton, whose family owned half of the commercial real estate in New England. Every call was a performance. "I just closed a 7-figure campaign," she told me one night. "What about you, Myra? Still doing those little photo shoots in the park?" I was sitting in my office at the time, looking at a contract for a celebrity wedding that was worth more than her entire annual salary. "I'm doing well, Victoria," I said. "Congratulations on your campaign." She didn't even ask what well meant. She just told me our parents were throwing her a celebration dinner and added, with a casual cruelty that still stung, "Obviously, you're not invited. It's just immediate family." Immediate family. The phrase sat in my throat like broken glass. But I hung up, looked at the awards on my wall, and told myself I didn't need their approval. I had built a life they couldn't even imagine. But then, the call came that changed the stakes. It was a Tuesday morning, and my phone rang with a Boston number I didn't recognize. Miss Wells? This is Harrison Lawson, your grandmother's attorney. I'm sorry to inform you that Eleanor Hartwell passed away last night. The world stopped. Grandma Eleanor was 82, and while I knew she'd been slowing down, I'd always believed there would be one more visit, one more chance to show her that her seed had grown into an empire. I flew to Boston that afternoon, but I didn't go to the Colonial House in Beacon Hill. I went straight to the attorney's office. The funeral at Trinity Church was a sea of black wool and performative grief. My parents were in the front row, accepting condolences as if they were receiving awards. Victoria stood beside them, dabbing her eyes with a designer handkerchief. But as I sat in the third row, invisible as always, I saw them whispering. I saw them looking at Grandma Eleanor's casket and then at each other, their eyes darting with a greedy, focused energy. The jewelry collection, I heard Victoria hiss under her breath as the choir began to sing. Have you talked to the lawyer about the Hartwell pearls? My mother just nodded, her face a mask of sorrow that didn't reach her eyes. After the service, she whispered back. They weren't mourning a woman, they were auditing an estate. They had no idea that Grandma Eleanor had been auditing them for 28 years, and she had just finished the final report. As the service ended, Mr. Lawson caught my eye and gestured toward a small office at the back of the church. Miss Wells, he said quietly. Your grandmother left a secondary will. And I think you're going to find the contents illuminating. The air in Mr. Lawson's office was thick with the scent of old paper and the kind of heavy, silent history that only exists in the backrooms of Boston law firms. Outside, the muffled bells of Trinity Church were still tolling for Grandma Eleanor, but inside, the world was narrowing down to a single manila envelope. Lawson didn't look at me with the dismissive pity I'd grown used to from the Wells circle. He looked at me with a profound, quiet respect. He slid the envelope across the mahogany desk, and as my fingers touched the cool paper, I felt a jolt of electricity. Your grandmother came to see me 2 years ago, Lawson began, his voice a low gravel. She was very specific. She knew that her public will, the one leaving the real estate and the liquid assets to your father and Victoria, would be the only thing they'd look at. She called it the shiny distraction. But this? This is the heart of the Hartwell estate. I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 legal documents and a letter on cream-colored stationery, the ink still bold and defiant. The first document was a notarized amendment. I read the words once, then twice, my breath hitching in my chest. The Hartwell jewelry collection. It wasn't just a few sets of pearls. It was a centuries-old hoard of sapphires, emeralds, and diamonds, a collection valued at over $2 million. And according to the bold, black ink of the amendment, it was mine. All of it. Not a single stone for Victoria. Not a solitary gold link for my mother. It was the ultimate architectural strike against the family's vanity. Grandma Eleanor hadn't just left me money, she'd left me the very symbols of status my family used to define their worth. She had handed me the crown jewels of Beacon Hill and told me to keep them in my pocket while the rest of the family fought over the furniture. I opened the letter, my hands trembling as I recognized her elegant, looping script. My dearest Myra, it began. If you're reading this, the house of cards is already starting to lean. Victoria sees these pieces as trophies, status symbols to be displayed like hunters' kills. But you, my darling girl, you see their history. You understand that beauty isn't about possession, it's about preservation. Your mother and sister will be angry. They will call this a mistake. But I have watched you build an empire out of light and shadows while they were busy polishing their mirrors. These pieces belong with someone who will honor them. They belong with you. Use them when the light is right. I pressed the letter to my heart, the weight of her belief in me finally eclipsing the decade of silence from my parents. Lawson leaned forward, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. There's a condition, Myra. Your grandmother requested that this remains strictly confidential until you decide the moment is right. She called it the artist's timing. I nodded, tucking the documents into my bag. I walked out of that church with a $2 million secret sitting in my purse, passing Victoria and my mother as they argued with a caterer in the vestibule. They didn't even look at me. They were too busy counting the silver to realize I'd already taken the gold. 3 months passed, and the silence from Boston grew deafening, punctuated only by the digital noise of Victoria's life. I was back in Los Angeles, back in the sleek, glass-walled hive of Everlight Studios, but my mind was perpetually stuck in that lawyer's office. I watched through the lens of social media as the social event of the decade began to take shape. Victoria was engaged to Marcus Thornton, a man whose family tree was essentially a map of New England's power structures. Every post was a tactical strike of wealth. The 5-carat rock on her finger, the private tours of the Grand Belmont ballroom, the intimate bridal brunch where my mother toasted to the only daughter who made us proud. I waited for the invitation. I checked the mail every afternoon, the silver Leica sitting on my desk like a silent witness. I told myself it was just a delay, a mailing error, a casualty of the Thornton-sized guest list. But the weeks bled into months, and the mailbox remained empty. Finally, the curiosity, or perhaps the lingering ghost of the girl who wanted to belong, got the better of me. I called my mother. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up, her voice sounding distracted, the background filled with the frantic clinking of china. "Mom, it's Myra. I haven't seen the invitation for Victoria's wedding yet. I wanted to make sure it didn't get lost in the mail." There was a pause, a long, hollow silence that felt like the air being sucked out of a room. "Myra," she said, her voice dropping into that careful, performative tone she used when she was about to deliver a blow. "Victoria wanted me to talk to you about that. The wedding, it's very intimate. We've had to be extremely selective with the guest list. Space at the Grand Belmont is so limited, and Marcus's family has so many requirements. Selectivity. Intimacy." I looked at my computer screen, where Victoria's latest Instagram story showed a seating chart for 400 people. 400 guests is intimate, Mom? I asked, my voice as flat as the horizon. Another pause, sharper this time. "You know how you can be at these events, Myra. Awkward. We don't want anything to distract from Victoria's Day. We don't want people asking questions about your lifestyle in California. It's better this way. We'll send you photos." I hung up before she could offer me a later that would never happen. I sat in my $3 million studio, surrounded by a team that looked to me for vision, and I realized the foundation was finally dry. They hadn't just uninvited me, they had erased me to protect a brand. They wanted the world to believe the Wells family was a perfect success story. They wanted to bury the starving artist's sister in the backyard so she wouldn't stain the white carpet of the Thornton merger. The decision didn't come from a place of anger, it came from a place of clarity. I wasn't going to Boston to beg. I wasn't going to make a scene or throw wine at the Vera Wang. I was going to deliver a gift. I booked my flight 3 days before the ceremony, Los Angeles to Logan, one way. I didn't tell a soul. I spent the afternoon in my studio, meticulously preparing a small silver box. I lined it with black velvet and placed a series of documents inside, each one a thread that, when pulled, would unravel the tapestry of lies my sister had woven for the Thorntons. I included a copy of the Hartwell Amendment. I included the letter from Grandma Eleanor. And then, I added the final piece of the puzzle, a document that even the Thornton family's private investigators had missed. See, there was something Victoria didn't know about her perfect wedding. She had hired the most exclusive wedding planning agency on the East Coast, Ashford Events, to handle every detail. What she didn't know was that Caroline Ashford had been Grandma Eleanor's closest friend for 40 years. And she certainly didn't know that Caroline had called me 2 months ago, crying over the way my family had treated me at the funeral. Myra, Caroline had whispered over the encrypted line. Your sister is demanding the Hartwell pearls for her something old. She's told the Thorntons she's inheriting the entire collection. She's even signed a contract with a photography firm she found in a luxury magazine. She thinks she's hiring the best in the world. I had looked at the contract Caroline emailed me. The client was Victoria Wells. The firm was Everlight Studios. Victoria had unknowingly hired the company I owned, the sister she called a failure, to document the very wedding I wasn't invited to. I packed the silver box into my carry-on, the weight of it feeling like a settled debt. I sat in my window seat as the plane lifted off the runway, the lights of Los Angeles shrinking below me. I thought about the Grand Belmont, about the 400 guests who were about to witness a very different kind of ceremony. I thought about the Hartwell jewels, currently sitting in a secure vault in Boston, waiting for their rightful owner. Victoria wanted a day where everyone looked at her. I was about to give her exactly what she wanted. I closed my eyes as we crossed the Rockies, the silver box tucked under the seat in front of me. I wasn't the invisible sister anymore. I was the one holding the lens, and I was finally ready to focus. As the plane began its descent into the Atlantic fog, my phone buzzed with a notification from the Everlight lead photographer I'd sent to Boston in my place. Team is on site. Victoria is in the penthouse. She's asking for the owner to come up and personally check the lighting. I smiled into the dark. She wanted the owner. She was about to get her. The silver box felt deceptively light in my lap as the taxi crawled through the rain-slicked streets of Boston toward the Grand Belmont. Inside that box sat the end of a 28-year-old lie, a collection of papers that weighed more than the diamonds themselves. I looked out at the familiar brownstones of Beacon Hill, the neighborhood that had tried to bury me in the shadows of my sister's ambition. Victoria was currently in the penthouse suite, surrounded by bridesmaids and makeup artists, preparing to marry into the Thornton dynasty. She had spent months telling Marcus and his family that her sister was a troubled soul in California, a starving artist who couldn't hold down a job, a liability that had to be cut off for the sake of the family brand. She had built her new life on the scorched earth of my reputation. But as the taxi pulled up to the gilded canopy of the hotel, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about Grandma Eleanor. She had given me that first Leica because she knew that a lens doesn't just capture beauty, it captures the truth. And the truth was sitting in the back of a black SUV idling behind my taxi. My lead photography team from Everlight Studios was already inside, setting up the lighting rigs that Victoria had personally requested. She had paid a $15,000 non-refundable deposit to my firm, obsessed with the cinematic prestige of our portfolio. She wanted the best in the world to document her ascent, never realizing that the best was the sister she'd blocked from her guest list. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cold Atlantic wind whipping at my navy dress, and felt the settling of a great, invisible weight. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't a bridesmaid. I was the silent auditor of the Wells family legacy, and the audit was about to begin. I walked through the revolving doors into a lobby that smelled of expensive lilies and old money. The air was thick with the hum of a 400-guest production. I saw the Thornton cousins in their bespoke tuxedos, the Wells family associates preening in the mirrors, and my mother, Patricia, moving through the crowd like a general inspecting her troops. She looked radiant, her pearls gleaming under the chandeliers, the very pearls she believed Victoria would inherit by the end of the night. I stayed near the marble columns, a ghost in a room full of people who had been trained to look past me. I walked to the reception table, where two women in black were guarding the leather-bound guest list. When I gave my name, the silence that followed was louder than the string quartet. I watched them flip through the pages, their eyes widening with that familiar, stinging pity as they confirmed what I already knew: I didn't exist here. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the woman whispered, her voice a fragile shield against the awkwardness. "Your name isn't on the list." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply pulled out my phone and dialed Victoria's private line. When she picked up, the cocktail hour noise in the background was a roar of success. Victoria, it's Myra. I'm in the lobby. My name isn't on the list. The silence on the other end was cold, a calculated vacuum. I know, she finally said, her voice a sharp, brittle blade. Because you weren't invited. This wedding is for people who matter, Myra. People who have a future. Go back to your little life and stop pretending you belong in ours. She hung up, a definitive click. I stood there, looking at the silver box, and realized that the intimate lie was finally dead. I placed the box on the edge of the gift table, right next to a towering package from Tiffany's, and I walked away. But I didn't go back to the airport. I went to the service elevator. The penthouse floor was a labyrinth of white roses and frantic energy. I could hear the high-pitched laughter of the bridesmaids and the steady, authoritative voice of my mother through the double doors of the bridal suite. I stood in the hallway, the silver leica around my neck, the weight of it feeling like an anchor. My lead photographer, Jenna, stepped out of the suite, her eyes widening when she saw me. Myra? What are you doing here? Victoria is losing her mind. She's demanding to see the owner to approve the final lighting for the processional. I adjusted the strap of my camera, the metal cold against my skin. Then let's give her the owner, Jenna. It's time for a personal consultation. I walked into the suite, and the world slowed down. Victoria was standing on a pedestal in the center of the room, a vision of ivory lace and calculated perfection. She looked like a queen, but as she turned and saw me standing in the doorway, the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. The bridesmaids went silent. My mother dropped a glass of champagne, the crystal shattering against the marble floor like a starting gun. Myra, my mother whispered, her face going a ghostly shade of gray. What are you? How did you get up here? Victoria stepped off the pedestal, her train rustling like a warning. I told you to leave, Myra. I told you that you weren't wanted. If the Thorntons see you here, if they find out you're this, it ruins everything. Get out before I have you thrown out. I didn't move. I raised the leica and took a single photo. The flash was a sharp, clinical strike that illuminated the fear in her eyes. I'm not here as your sister, Victoria, I said, my voice as steady as a heart monitor. I'm here as the owner of Everlight Studios. You signed a contract with my firm. You paid for my vision. And since you're so concerned about the regal angles of your big day, I thought I should personally ensure that the lighting reflects the truth. Victoria's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. You own Everlight? That's impossible. You're a failure. You're a starving artist. I stepped closer, pulling a copy of the contract from my bag. $3 million in revenue last year, Victoria. 12 employees. A client list that includes the very people you're trying to impress downstairs. You didn't hire a failure. You hired me. My mother grabbed the back of a chair, her hand shaking. 3 million? Myra. Why didn't you say anything? I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a mother. I saw a stranger who had spent 28 years looking at a shadow. Because you never bothered to ask, Mom. You were too busy looking at Victoria's shine to realize I was the one building the foundation. Victoria lunged forward, her lace sleeves catching on a floral arrangement, tearing a jagged hole in the perfect image. I don't care. I'll cancel the contract. I'll tell Marcus you tricked us. I just smiled. Go ahead. The deposit is non-refundable. And the Thorntons are already waiting for the grand entrance. But before you walk down that aisle, there's a gift waiting for you downstairs. A small silver box. It's from Grandma Eleanor. She wanted me to give it to you when the timing was artistically right. The grand ballroom was a cathedral of gold and white, 400 of Boston's elite waiting for the culmination of the Wells-Thornton merger. I stood at the back of the room, hidden behind a black curtain in the photography booth, my eye pressed to the viewfinder of my leica. I watched my father lead Victoria down the aisle, his face a mask of solemn pride, while Marcus Thornton waited at the altar with the rigid posture of a man who believed he was getting exactly what he paid for. The ceremony was a masterpiece of performance. The vows were rehearsed, the music was flawless, and the atmosphere was thick with the scent of a lie that had finally become a reality. But as the reception began, the energy in the room shifted. The silver box had been moved from the gift table to the head table, a special request from Caroline Ashford. She knew exactly what was inside. She knew that Grandma Eleanor had spent her final years watching her son and her granddaughter dismantle a legacy of love for a legacy of status. I watched through the long lens as Victoria and Marcus took their seats at the center of the room. They looked perfect. They looked untouchable. But as the MC took the microphone to announce the opening of the family gifts, I saw my mother lean in and whisper something to Victoria. Victoria's eyes darted toward the silver box. She looked triumphant. She thought she was about to receive the Hartwell pearls. She picked up the box, her fingers trembling with a greedy, focused energy. She untied the white ribbon, her smile wide for the cameras. She lifted the lid, expecting the shimmer of white gold and ancient gems. Instead, she found the legal amendment. She found the letter from Grandma Eleanor. And she found the contract for Everlight Studios with my name in bold, black ink. I watched through the lens as the color drained from her face, her eyes scanning the legal seals that declared the jewelry collection mine. I watched as her hand shook so violently that Eleanor's letter drifted to the floor, landing right at the feet of Marcus's father. Marcus leaned over, his brow furrowing as he read the words forgery and fraud in the legal notations Victoria had been trying to hide for months. The ballroom fell into a terrifying silence. 400 guests watched as the bride of the decade began to unravel in real time. My mother reached for the papers, her face a mask of shock that was being recorded by 3 of my cameras from 3 different angles. Victoria looked up, her eyes wild, searching the room for the person who had finally turned the lights on. She saw the flash of my Leica from the back of the room. She saw the sister she had erased, standing in the light, holding the lens. She opened her mouth to scream, to deny, to lie one last time. But before she could utter a single word, the doors at the back of the ballroom swung open, and Mr. Lawson, the estate attorney, stepped into the gold light with a second silver box and a team of private security. He wasn't looking at the bride. He was looking at me. "Miss Wells," he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "The vault has been cleared. The collection is ready for its rightful owner." The silence that followed Mr. Lawson's entrance wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a physical weight, a sudden drop in pressure that made the lungs of 400 people seize. I stood in the shadows of the photography booth, watching the high-definition collapse of the Wells family brand. Victoria was frozen at the head table, her fingers still tangled in the ribbon of the small silver box. Beside her, Marcus Thornton had picked up the fallen amendment, his face transforming from adoring groom to a man realizing he'd just signed a merger with a hollow shell. Mr. Lawson walked with the rhythmic, heavy tread of a man delivering a verdict. Every flash from my team's cameras caught the glint of the second, much larger silver box in his hands, the one that held the Hartwell history. "Mr. Lawson, what is the meaning of this?" My father's voice finally broke through, sharp and brittle. He stood at the head table, his face a bruised purple, his hand gripping the back of Victoria's chair. Lawson stopped 10 feet from the dais. "The meaning, Harold, is probate. Your daughter Myra has exercised her right as the sole beneficiary of the Hartwell jewelry collection. As per Eleanor's explicit instructions, the transfer is to be executed publicly, in the presence of the family, to ensure there is no ambiguity regarding the chain of custody." A collective gasp rippled through the Thornton rows. Victoria finally found her voice, a high-pitched, jagged scream. "She's lying. Myra forged those papers. She's been in California for 10 years. "Victoria, be quiet," Marcus whispered, but the microphone on the table caught it. He was looking at the signature on the amendment, then at the handwritten letter from Grandma Eleanor that sat in the middle of the table like a live grenade. I stepped out from behind the black curtain of the booth, the navy silk of my dress catching the light as I walked down the center aisle. 400 heads turned. The invisible sister was walking through the cathedral of their judgment, holding the lens. I reached the head table and looked at my mother. She was staring at me, her hand pressed to her throat where her own pearls seemed to be choking her. "You uninvited me because I was a distraction, Mom," I said, my voice carrying through the hall. "But you forgot that Grandma Eleanor loved the theater. She knew exactly when to bring up the house lights. The transition from a wedding to an audit is a violent thing." Within minutes, the Grand Belmont's ballroom had shifted from a celebration of love to a crime scene of social status. I stood at the head table as the guests leaned in with their phones raised, documenting the success fact-check in real time. A prominent CEO near the Thornton patriarch began whispering loudly about Everlight's revenue. I watched the math happen on my father's face. The recalculation of a man who realized the daughter he'd cut off was currently out-earning the one he'd bet the family reputation on. Victoria was unraveling, her custom gown looking like a straitjacket. "You think you're better than me?" she hissed. "You think because some senile old woman liked your pictures that you can take what's mine?" "It was never yours, Victoria," I said. "You spent 6 months telling Marcus you were inheriting a $2 million collection to shore up your status. You used Grandma's memory as collateral for a life you hadn't earned. You even used my company to film your lie." Marcus stood up, his chair scraping against the marble with a sound like a bone breaking. "Is it true, Victoria?" he asked, his voice low. "Did you tell my parents you were the sole heir to the Hartwell estate to satisfy the prenup requirements?" Victoria's silence was the loudest thing in the room. She looked at our parents, searching for a script, a lie, a later that would save her. But they were looking at the legal documents Lawson had spread across the table. They were looking at the truth. I reached into the small silver box and pulled out the Everlight Studios contract. I laid it on top of the legal papers. The non-refundable deposit was $15,000, Victoria. You paid for a professional to document your big day. And since I'm a professional, I've made sure my team has captured every second of this. I gestured to the rafters, where the high-angle cameras were still rolling. The room began to fracture. Marcus's father, a man who looked like he'd been carved from New England granite, stood up and walked to the dais. He didn't look at Victoria. He looked at my father. "Harold," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "I believe there has been a significant misrepresentation of assets. We will be discussing the annulment in the morning." The Grand Belmont was no longer a palace, it was a ruin with a 5-star catering contract. As the Thornton family began a coordinated withdrawal, the Wells family was left standing on the dais, a trio of disgraced architects looking at the rubble of their curation. My mother was slumped in her chair. Victoria was screaming now, a raw, primal sound, her hands tearing at the lace of her sleeves. But Lawson wasn't moving. He opened the larger silver box, and the ballroom lights caught the fire of the Hartwell sapphires. The blue was so deep it looked like the Atlantic at midnight. The remaining guests gasped, a final tribute to the beauty Grandma Eleanor had hidden from the people who only wanted to own it. I didn't reach for the jewels. I looked at my father, who was staring at the sapphires with a hunger that made my stomach turn. "She left them to you," he whispered. "She knew. She knew you were the only one who could keep the firm afloat." I shook my head. "She didn't leave them to me to save you, Dad. She left them to me to save them from you." I turned to Lawson and gave him a single nod. "Mr. Lawson, please execute the museum transfer. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts is expecting the collection by dawn. The Hartwell legacy is going into a vault where it can be seen by everyone and owned by no one." Victoria lunged across the table, her hands reaching for the sapphires, the desperate, final grab. But she never touched the stones. The security detail stepped in, a wall of dark wool that blocked her path. She fell back into her chair, her custom veil snagging on a crystal centerpiece, pulling her head back in a mocking bow. The social event of the decade was officially over. I turned and walked toward the exit, past the empty chairs and the photographers who were still capturing the fallout. I reached the revolving doors, the cold air meeting me with a promise of a life that didn't require a seating chart. I pulled out my phone to book my flight back to Los Angeles. But as the taxi pulled away, a message flashed on my screen, an alert from the Everlight server. A private video file had just been uploaded from the penthouse suite, time-stamped 10 minutes before the ceremony. I hit play, and the words my father and sister were whispering made the silver box in my lap feel like it was filled with lead. The video file on my phone screen was grainy, but the betrayal was high definition. In the frame, Victoria was standing by the window. My father was standing behind her, his hands on her shoulders, but he wasn't offering a blessing. He was leaning in, his voice a low, predatory hiss. "The Thornton merger is the only thing keeping the Wells name off the foreclosure list, Victoria," he whispered. "If Myra shows up with those papers, if she mentions the Hartwell jewels aren't in the safe, you deny it. You tell Marcus she's been unstable since graduation. We need that Thornton signature on the bridge loan by midnight, or we lose the Beacon Hill house." I sat in the back of the taxi, the yellow streetlights strobing across my face like a polygraph test. They had built a contingency plan around my instability to protect a house that was already hollow. I looked at the silver Leica in my lap. Victoria wasn't just a spoiled bride, and my father wasn't just a distant patriarch. They were architects of a fraud that required my social death to succeed. I didn't call the police. I hit the global share button on the Everlight server. I sent the file to every guest on the digital seating chart, to Marcus Thornton's private email, and to the large projection screens in the Grand Belmont ballroom that were supposed to be showing a montage of Victoria's childhood. By the time my taxi reached the bridge, the marriage implosion was no longer a private affair. It was a digital wildfire. I watched the notifications scroll past. Marcus's parents leaving the hotel, the Thornton lawyers issuing a cease and desist to my father, and the viral video hitting 4 million views. I wasn't the invisible sister anymore. I was the one who had finally turned the lights on in a room full of thieves. I leaned back against the leather seat, the city skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in 28 years, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt like the sun. The silence of my Los Angeles studio was the most expensive thing I'd ever earned. It had been a week since the Grand Belmont became a crime scene of social reputation. Everlight Studios was no longer just a photography firm, it was a symbol of the truth check era. My assistant, Jenna, walked in. "Your mother is in the lobby, Myra. She's been sitting there for 3 hours. She didn't bring a lawyer. She just brought herself." I walked out to the lobby, and the woman sitting on the velvet sofa wasn't the general of the Wells army. Patricia Wells looked like a ghost that had been evicted from its own haunting. Her suit was wrinkled, her pearls were gone, and her eyes were red-rimmed. She stood up when she saw me, her hands trembling as she reached for a photograph on the wall. "You never told us," she whispered. "You never told us you were this successful. Why did you let us believe you were struggling?" I didn't offer her coffee. "Because you needed me to be a failure, Mom," I said. "You needed a shadow to make Victoria look brighter. You and Dad didn't want a daughter, you wanted a comparison. You taught me that my only value was being the person you didn't have to talk about at dinner parties." She flinched, the ugly, raw sobs starting to shake her shoulders. "We lost everything, Myra. The Thorntons sued for breach of contract. The Beacon Hill house is under a lien. Victoria. She's staying in a motel. She won't speak to your father." I looked at her, and the pity I felt wasn't for the loss of her wealth. It was for the loss of her soul. She had traded her child for a brand, and now the brand was bankrupt. I led her into my office and let her see the life I'd built. "I'm not going to save the house, Mom," I said. "And I'm not going to save the Wells name. But I'll pay for your apartment. I'll pay for your medical insurance. I'll give you a later that actually exists, but only if you stop looking for the girl who lived in the shadow. She's gone. I'm the one who owns the light now. She looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, she didn't see an awkward distraction. She saw the air that Grandma Eleanor had been training in the dark. The vault at the museum is a place where history goes to be safe. I stood in the center of the room, the Hartwell jewelry collection laid out on black velvet. The sapphires looked like fragments of the midnight sky, the diamonds felt like frozen lightning. They were no longer trophies. They were memories, preserved in a vault where they would be seen by thousands of people who would never know the names Wells or Thornton. I picked up the sapphire brooch, the one Grandma Eleanor had worn to my graduation when my parents were busy networking. It felt heavy and honest. I thought about the silver Leica she'd given a 10-year-old girl. I thought about the artist's timing. She hadn't left me the jewels to make me rich, she'd left them to me to make me free. She knew that the only way to break the cycle of Beacon Hill was to give the shadow the power to choose the light. I walked out of the museum into the crisp air of a Boston morning that finally felt like mine. I didn't check my phone. I walked toward the park, the silver camera around my neck, and I started to take pictures. Not of celebrities, not of weddings, but of the people who were invisible. The street performers, the tired commuters, the children playing in the shadows. I saw them all. I focused the lens, adjusted the aperture, and I captured the truth. The Wells family story is a ruin now, a cautionary tale of what happens when you build a house on the absence of love. But my story? My story is a masterpiece in progress. I've learned that the greatest response to being ignored isn't revenge. It's being undeniable. It's building a foundation so strong that no one's silence can shake it. I'm Myra Wells, and I'm no longer the invisible sister. I'm the one who stayed behind to make sure the beauty survived the fire. I'm the one who kept the heart, even when they tried to take the gold. And as the sun rose over the Atlantic, I realized that Grandma Eleanor was right. The greatest treasures are the ones quietly passed on, and the most valuable thing I ever inherited wasn't the diamonds. It was the eyes to see that I was already enough. The audit is over. The books are balanced. And finally, the light is just right.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.